The carriage wheel snapped just outside the gates of Ashcombe Manor, throwing Eleanor Whitlock into the mud with her only suitcase bursting open beside her. Rain poured down in sheets. A groundskeeper looked at her torn coat and muddy hands and did not offer to help. He simply said the new governess was expected inside within the hour, storm or no storm, and walked away. Eleanor gathered her scattered belongings with shaking fingers. A folded letter, her only reference, had landed in a puddle. She wiped it against her sleeve and pressed it to her chest, praying the ink had not smeared beyond reading. If this position fell through, she had nowhere else to go. Her last shillings were spent on the train ticket that brought her here. She walked the long gravel path alone, soaked through, her boots squelching with every step. Ashcombe Manor rose ahead of her like a mountain of stone and glass, its windows glowing with warm light that made her shivering body feel smaller still. She had heard whispers on the train about the man who owned this house, a widower, cold, unforgiving to those beneath him. She told herself none of that mattered. She needed the wage, and she needed it desperately. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Margaret, opened the servant's door and looked Eleanor over from head to toe with an expression somewhere between pity and disapproval. "You're soaked to the bone, girl. What were you thinking walking in this weather?" "I had no choice," Eleanor said quietly. "The carriage broke down." Margaret sighed and stepped aside to let her in. "Well, you'd best dry off before he sees you. Mr. Whitmore does not like surprises, and he certainly does not like tardiness." Eleanor was led through a maze of hallways lined with paintings of stern ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her damp footprints across the polished floor. She caught her own reflection in a gilded mirror and barely recognized herself. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a dress that had been mended so many times the stitching had become its own pattern. She had not always looked this way. There had been a time, long ago, when her family had money and comfort and laughter in every room of their house. But that time belonged to a childhood she rarely allowed herself to remember, because remembering only made the present harder to bear. Margaret handed her a plain gray dress to change into, the uniform of the household staff, and told her to hurry. "The children are difficult," she warned. "2 governesses before you left within a month. Don't take it personally if they test you." "I understand," Eleanor said, though she did not yet understand at all. She changed quickly, in a small room near the kitchen, wringing the rainwater from her hair with a rough towel, and was led up a grand staircase to meet the man who would decide whether she ate that week or went hungry. Damien Whitmore stood by the window of his study with his back to the door, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, though his shoulders carried the weight of someone twice his age. When he finally turned to look at her, his eyes were sharp, assessing, and entirely without warmth. "You are late," he said. "The carriage broke an axle, sir. I walked the rest of the way. I do not care for excuses, I care for results." He set down his glass and studied her for a long moment, taking in her plain dress, her damp hair, the exhaustion she could not quite hide. "You do not look like someone capable of managing my children." Eleanor lifted her chin, despite the tremor still running through her cold body. "I have taught before, sir. I know Latin, French, mathematics, and history. I am patient, and I do not frighten easily." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "We shall see about that. My son and daughter have driven away 2 governesses already. If you cannot manage them, you will be gone by the week's end, just as they were." "Then I will not fail," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Damien studied her a moment longer, as though trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to find in his study that evening. Then he waved a hand toward the door. "Margaret will show you to the schoolroom. The children rise at 7. Do not be late again." Eleanor curtsied and left, her heart pounding harder than it had during the entire storm outside. That night, she lay on a narrow bed in a small servant's room at the top of the house, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and thought about how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and sad, telling her that pride could not fill an empty stomach. She thought of the family that had turned their backs when her mother married a man they considered beneath her station. She thought of the years since her mother's passing, the boarding houses, the odd jobs, the constant fear of the next unpaid bill. She did not think, even for a moment, that anything about her past mattered anymore. That door, she believed, had closed forever. The following morning, Eleanor met her 2 young charges for the first time. Oliver, aged 9, and his younger sister Grace, aged 6, sat at a long table in the schoolroom with matching expressions of suspicion. Oliver had ink stains on his fingers from what looked like a recent act of rebellion, and Grace clutched a wooden doll so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Good morning, Eleanor said, keeping her voice gentle. My name is Miss Whitlock. I understand you are both very clever. Oliver crossed his arms. The last governess said we were impossible. Were you? Yes, Grace said proudly, before Oliver could stop her. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Well, I have taught impossible children before, and I rather enjoyed the challenge. Shall we begin with something you actually enjoy, instead of something you are told to enjoy? The children exchanged a glance, clearly unprepared for this approach. Oliver narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, I would like to know what interests you before I decide what to teach you. What is the last thing that made you curious? Grace spoke first, in a small voice. I want to know why the moon changes shape. That is an excellent question, Eleanor said, and meant it. Would you like to learn the answer today? By midday, Eleanor had the children drawing diagrams of the moon's phases on a chalkboard, and even Oliver, who had entered the room determined to dislike her, found himself asking a second question, then a third. Margaret passed by the schoolroom twice that afternoon, and each time paused at the door, surprised by the sound of laughter instead of shouting. Word of the new governess's quiet success spread through the household by evening, though Damien Whitmore said nothing of it. He merely watched from the hallway once, unseen, as Eleanor knelt beside his daughter to help her sound out a difficult word, patience, written into every line of her posture. He turned away before she noticed him, troubled by a curiosity he did not welcome. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Eleanor woke before dawn, taught until evening, and retired to her small room exhausted but strangely content. She began to notice small things about the house and its master. Damien rarely smiled, but when Grace ran to greet him in the evenings, something in his shoulders eased, if only for a moment. He worked long hours in his study, and the staff spoke of him in hushed, careful tones, as though grief still lived somewhere in the walls of Ashcombe Manor. One evening, as Eleanor walked past his study with a stack of books, she overheard him speaking with his solicitor about unpaid debts left behind by a distant cousin, and the difficulty of managing an estate while raising 2 children alone. She did not mean to eavesdrop, but something in his voice, tired and burdened, made her pause. She realized, in that moment, that wealth did not shield a person from loneliness, it only dressed loneliness in finer clothing. She continued down the hallway before he could catch her listening, her mind turning over a truth she had not expected to find inside these grand walls. The man everyone called cold was simply a man carrying more than he could easily hold. By the end of her first week, Eleanor had earned something she had not expected. Not comfort, not security, but the beginning of respect, both from 2 children who had chased away every governess before her, and from a master of the house who had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to watch her more closely than he watched anyone else in his household. She did not know yet how much that quiet attention would come to change her life. She only knew that for the first time in years, she had found a place where she was needed, and that alone was enough to keep her moving forward, one difficult day at a time. 3 weeks passed, and the household at Ashcombe Manor had quietly transformed. Grace no longer cried at bedtime, and Oliver had stopped sneaking out to the stables during lesson hours. Instead, both children waited eagerly each morning for Eleanor to arrive at the schoolroom door, often with a new question about the world they wanted answered before breakfast was finished. Damien noticed the change, though he told himself it meant nothing beyond a competent hire. He told himself this every time he found an excuse to walk past the schoolroom window. He told himself this the evening he heard Grace laughing so loudly that it carried down 2 flights of stairs, a sound he had not heard in his home since his wife's passing 3 years earlier. He told himself this again, less convincingly, the day he found Eleanor in the library after hours, standing on a small stool to reach a book on the highest shelf, speaking to herself in fluent French as she read the title aloud. "You read French?" he asked, startling her so badly she nearly toppled from the stool. Eleanor caught the shelf to steady herself, her cheeks flushing. "A little, sir. I taught myself years ago." "Taught yourself," he repeated, watching her carefully. "That is an unusual skill for someone in your position." "I enjoy learning," Eleanor said simply, stepping down and smoothing her plain gray dress. "It costs nothing but time, and I have always had more time than money." Damien said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not read. There was something about the way she carried herself, the straightness of her spine despite her worn clothing, the elegance in her speech despite her humble station, that did not quite match the story she presented to the household. He filed the observation away without comment and left the library without another word, though the memory lingered with him longer than he expected. It was not the last time he would notice something that did not fit. A week later, during a rare visit from his sister, Lady Charlotte, Eleanor was asked to bring the children down for tea in the drawing room. Lady Charlotte, elegant and sharp-tongued, looked Eleanor over the moment she entered with the children in tow. "So this is the governess everyone speaks of," Charlotte said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "The poor little thing who walked here in the rain with a broken suitcase. How very charming." Eleanor kept her expression calm, though the words stung more than she let show. "I am simply here to teach the children, my lady." "Of course you are." Charlotte's eyes swept over Eleanor's plain dress with obvious disdain. "Tell me, dear, where exactly does someone like you learn to speak so properly? Your accent is far too refined for a girl who arrived here with holes in her shoes." The room fell quiet. Oliver shifted uncomfortably beside Eleanor, sensing the tension, though not fully understanding it. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to old grief resurfacing. "My mother believed education mattered more than money," Eleanor said carefully. "She taught me to speak well, long before circumstances changed for our family." "How very noble of her," Charlotte said, clearly unconvinced, and turned to pour her tea as though the matter no longer interested her. It was Damien, standing near the fireplace, who spoke next, his voice cutting through the room with unexpected firmness. "Charlotte, that is enough." His sister turned, surprised. "I was only making conversation, Damien." "You were making my governess uncomfortable in my own home," he said. "Miss Whitlock has done more for my children in 3 weeks than the previous 2 governesses managed in 3 months combined. I would ask you to remember that when you speak to her." Charlotte's mouth opened, then closed again, clearly unused to being corrected by her younger brother. She said nothing further on the matter, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor with renewed, calculating interest for the remainder of the visit. Eleanor said nothing as she led the children back upstairs afterward, but her heart was racing in a way she did not fully understand. She told herself it was simply relief at being defended. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way Damien's voice had sounded when he spoke on her behalf, low and certain, as though her dignity mattered to him. She told herself many things that evening, and believed almost none of them by the time she finally fell asleep. The following weeks brought a quiet shift between them, small and easy to miss unless one was paying close attention. Damien began joining the children's evening lessons more often, standing at the back of the schoolroom with his arms crossed, watching Eleanor explain the movement of planets or the causes of a distant war, with patience he had rarely seen in anyone, let alone someone employed to work beneath him. One evening after the children had been put to bed, he found her in the study returning a book he had lent her the week before, one on the history of trade routes she had mentioned finding interesting. "Did you finish it?" he asked. "I did," Eleanor said, setting the book on his desk, "though I confess I disagreed with the author's conclusion on the 3rd chapter. Damien raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued despite himself. "Disagreed how?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "He argues that trade always benefits the wealthy first and the poor last. I think that is only true when the wealthy design the rules to keep it that way. It is not trade itself that fails people. It is the men who control it." Damien studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "That is a rather bold opinion for someone who claims to have taught herself from borrowed books." "I did not realize opinions required permission, sir." A faint, almost startled smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose they do not." They spoke for nearly an hour that evening, longer than either of them intended, discussing books and history and the strange workings of the world, until Margaret knocked politely to remind Eleanor of the early morning ahead. Eleanor left the study with her heart unsteady in a way she had not felt in years, and Damien remained behind, staring at the closed door long after she had gone, wondering when exactly his governess had become someone whose company he looked forward to more than he cared to admit. Autumn deepened around Ashcombe Manor, painting the grounds in gold and rust, and with it came an unspoken shift the entire household seemed to notice before either Damien or Eleanor allowed themselves to acknowledge it. Margaret began setting an extra cup of tea in the study each evening without being asked. The children began teasing their father gently about the amount of time he spent near the schoolroom. Even the stable hands whispered among themselves about the way the master's carriage now lingered near the front steps longer than necessary on mornings when Eleanor walked the children through the gardens. Eleanor tried to ignore the whispers, focusing instead on her work, on Oliver's steady improvement in mathematics, on Grace's growing confidence in reading aloud without stumbling. But she could not ignore the way her pulse quickened whenever Damien entered a room unexpectedly, nor the quiet warmth that settled in her chest each time he sought her opinion on something beyond the children's education. One crisp afternoon, while walking the grounds with the children to collect fallen leaves for a nature lesson, Eleanor slipped on a patch of wet stone near the old stone bridge and fell hard against the railing, twisting her ankle badly enough that she could not stand without support. Oliver ran ahead to fetch help while Grace knelt beside her, frightened and unsure what to do. Damien arrived within minutes, having been informed by a breathless stable boy that the governess had fallen near the bridge. He knelt beside her without hesitation, his usual composure entirely abandoned. "Can you move it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern as he examined her ankle with careful hands. "I believe so, sir. It is only twisted, not broken." "You are not walking back to the house on this," he said firmly, and before she could protest, he lifted her carefully into his arms, carrying her the entire distance back to the manor, while Grace and Oliver trailed behind, exchanging wide-eyed glances neither child quite understood the meaning of, though both sensed something important had shifted between their father and their governess. Eleanor, held against his chest, felt her cheeks burn despite the pain in her ankle. "This is not necessary, sir. I could have managed." "Perhaps," Damien said quietly, not slowing his pace, "but I did not wish to take the chance." He carried her all the way to a small parlor near the kitchen and set her gently onto a couch, kneeling again to examine her ankle more closely, while Margaret hurried to fetch cold water and bandages. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the closeness of the situation settling heavily between them. "Thank you," Eleanor finally said, her voice softer than she intended. Damien looked up at her, his usual guarded expression entirely absent. "You have done more for this house in a few short weeks than you likely realize, Miss Whitlock. I would not see you injured on my grounds without doing everything in my power to help." Something passed between them in that quiet moment, unspoken but undeniable, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever this was growing between them had moved far beyond the boundaries of employer and governess. Eleanor did not know whether to feel hope or fear at the realization. She only knew that her heart, guarded for so long against disappointment, had begun to open in a way she had never allowed since the day her family lost everything. Damien, for his part, sat beside her a while longer than propriety strictly required, watching Margaret wrap her ankle with careful hands, and found himself thinking, for the first time since his wife's death, that perhaps loneliness was not a permanent condition after all. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping Ashcombe Manor in frost and silence, and with it came a decision that would upend every careful boundary Eleanor and Damien had maintained since the day she first walked through his gates. It began with a letter, delivered on a gray December morning, informing Damien that his late wife's family expected him to remarry within the year, citing the children's need for a proper mother and the estate's need for a proper mistress. Attached to the letter was a list of suitable candidates, women of wealth and standing, each one chosen for the size of her dowry rather than the shape of her heart. Damien read the letter twice in his study, then set it aside with a weariness that had nothing to do with the hour. He had spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, burying himself in work and grief rather than face the expectation that he replace what he had lost with someone chosen for convenience rather than affection. But the pressure had only grown heavier with time, and now it demanded an answer he no longer had the patience to delay. That evening, he found Eleanor in the schoolroom long after the children had gone to bed, sorting through a stack of essays Oliver had written about the history of the region. She looked up when he entered, surprised by the lateness of his visit. "Is something wrong, sir?" "No," Damien said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He sat across from her, unusually hesitant, turning a folded letter over in his hands before finally setting it on the table between them. "My late wife's family believes I should remarry. They have provided a list of candidates they consider suitable." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "That seems a reasonable expectation for a man in your position, sir." "Does it?" Damien asked, watching her closely. "I confess I find none of the names on that list particularly appealing." "Perhaps appeal is not the point of such arrangements," Eleanor said quietly, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Damien was silent for a long moment, studying her face as though searching for something specific. "I disagree," he finally said. "I believe appeal matters a great deal, particularly when the person in question has already shown more warmth toward my children, and toward me, than anyone on that entire list is likely to offer in a lifetime." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn even before he continued. "I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor," Damien said, using her given name for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Manor. "Not because tradition demands a wife, and not because the children need a mother, though both of those things are true. I am asking because these past months have shown me something I thought I had lost forever, and I do not wish to lose it again by settling for someone chosen from a list." For a long moment Eleanor could not speak. Every practical instinct she had cultivated over years of hardship screamed caution, warned her that such a proposal from a man of his station could only end in scandal and ruin for someone in her position. The world outside these walls would not be kind to a governess who married above her station, no matter how genuine the affection between them. But beneath that caution lived something older and quieter, a hope she had buried so deeply she had almost forgotten its existence, the simple wish to be loved not despite her circumstances, but entirely apart from them. "You understand what this will mean," she finally said. "The scandal, the whispers. Your family will never accept me. My family's opinion has never once kept my children fed or laughing or curious about the world," Damien said firmly. "You have done that, and I find, quite against my own expectations, that I would rather face every whisper in society than spend another year pretending I do not feel what I feel for you." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, memories of her mother's warnings about pride and practicality, warring with the steady conviction in Damien's voice. When she opened them again, she found herself nodding before she had fully decided to. "Then yes," she said softly, "I will marry you." The engagement was announced within the week, and exactly as Eleanor had predicted, the reaction from society was swift and merciless. Lady Charlotte arrived within days, furious and humiliated, demanding to know how her brother could disgrace the family name by marrying a penniless governess, with no lineage worth mentioning. "You will be a laughingstock," Charlotte hissed at Damien in the privacy of his study, unaware that Eleanor stood just outside the door, close enough to hear every word. "Every family of standing will refuse our invitations. Every door in this county will close to us." "Then let them close," Damien said calmly. "I did not ask for your approval, Charlotte. I informed you as a courtesy." "A courtesy?" Charlotte repeated bitterly. "You are throwing away everything our family has built for the sake of a woman who arrived here in rags." "That woman," Damien said, his voice hardening, "has shown more genuine character in 3 months than most of the women on your precious list have shown in their entire lives. I would ask you not to speak of her that way again in my home." Eleanor slipped away before either of them noticed her presence, her chest tight with a mixture of gratitude and dread. She understood, more clearly than ever, the price Damien was prepared to pay for choosing her, and the weight of that sacrifice settled heavily on her shoulders as the wedding date approached. The ceremony itself was small, quiet, and attended by far fewer guests than the wedding of a man in Damien's position would normally command. Many of the invited families sent polite refusals citing prior engagements, though everyone understood the true reason behind their absence. Eleanor wore a simple gown, altered from one that had belonged to Damien's late wife, and stood before the small gathering with her chin lifted despite the whispers she could hear even during the ceremony itself. "Marrying beneath his station," someone murmured from the pews. "She will not last a year in that house," another voice added, just loud enough to carry. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on Damien throughout the vows, refusing to let the whispers shake the steadiness in her voice, as she promised herself to him in front of witnesses, who clearly doubted the marriage would survive its first difficult season. Damien, for his part, held her hands firmly and spoke his vows without a trace of hesitation, his eyes never once leaving hers, as though the rest of the room and its judgment simply did not exist for him. Oliver and Grace sat in the front pew, beaming with a happiness that seemed entirely untouched by the tension surrounding the adults around them. To them, this was simply the woman who had taught them to love learning again, finally becoming a permanent part of their family, and no amount of adult scandal could dim their joy at the thought. After the ceremony, as the small gathering moved to the reception hall for a modest celebration, Eleanor found herself standing near a window, watching snow begin to fall over the grounds of Ashcombe Manor, now truly her home in every sense of the word. Margaret approached quietly, offering a rare smile. "For what it's worth, my lady," Margaret said, using Eleanor's new title for the first time. "I have worked in this house a long while, and I have never seen the master smile as often as he has these past months. Whatever the gossips say, I believe you have brought something back to this family that we all feared was lost for good." Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected tears at the kindness in Margaret's words. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more to me than you know." Later that evening, once the small gathering had dispersed and the children had finally been coaxed to bed despite their excitement, Damien found Eleanor still standing by the same window, watching the snow blanket the gardens in silver. "Regretting your decision already?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Eleanor shook her head, leaning slightly into his presence without fully realizing she had done so. "No, I was simply thinking how strange it is that the worst storm of my life led me to the gates of this house, and now I cannot imagine my life anywhere else." Damien took her hand, his voice quiet and certain. Whatever comes next, Eleanor, whatever the gossips choose to believe about us, I want you to know that marrying you is the first decision I have made in 3 years that has felt entirely, completely right. Neither of them could have known, standing together in that quiet moment of hard-won happiness, how soon that certainty would be tested by a truth neither of them yet understood. A secret buried in Eleanor's past that was about to surface and change everything they believed about the life they had just begun to build together. 6 weeks into their marriage, a stranger arrived at the gates of Ashcombe Manor, and the arrival of that single carriage would shatter the fragile peace Eleanor and Damien had only just begun to build. The man introduced himself to Margaret as Mr. Bennet, a solicitor from London, and asked, with unusual urgency, whether a woman named Eleanor Ashworth resided at the estate. Margaret, confused by the unfamiliar surname, informed him that no such woman lived at Ashcombe Manor, though the new lady of the house was named Eleanor Whitmore, formerly Whitlock. Mr. Bennet's eyes widened at this information, and he requested, quite insistently, to speak with the lady of the house immediately. Eleanor was summoned to the drawing room, her heart pounding with an unease she could not quite explain. The moment she entered and saw the solicitor's face, something cold settled in her stomach, a distant memory stirring that she had spent years trying to forget. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Bennet said, rising respectfully, "forgive my intrusion. I have been searching for a woman named Eleanor Ashworth for nearly 2 months now, following a trail that led me first through several counties before finally arriving here. Your maiden name, I understand, was Whitlock, though I have reason to believe this may not be your birth name at all." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she took a seat, Damien entering the room just in time to hear the solicitor's final words. He moved to stand protectively beside her, his expression sharpening with concern. "What is this regarding?" Damien asked. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat and retrieved a thick folder from his case. "I represent the estate of the late Charles Ashworth, a wealthy landowner who passed away 4 months ago. Mr. Ashworth left behind a substantial fortune, including several properties and considerable holdings, with instructions that everything be transferred to his only surviving granddaughter, a woman he identified in his final will as Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of his estranged daughter Margaret Ashworth, who married beneath her station some 20 years ago against her family's wishes." The room fell utterly silent. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as pieces of a past she had spent years burying suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. "My mother's name was Margaret," Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never spoke of her family. She told me they had disowned her when she married my father, and that they wanted nothing to do with either of us." Mr. Bennet nodded gravely. "That much appears to be true, madam. Charles Ashworth cut his daughter off entirely following her marriage, refusing all contact for nearly 2 decades. However, in the final year of his life, after learning of his daughter's passing, he grew determined to locate her only child before his own death. His search led investigators through records of workhouses, boarding schools, and eventually to a position you held as a governess in the north, before coming to Ashcombe Manor. I am afraid the trail went cold for some months, which delayed my arrival considerably." Damien's hand found Eleanor's shoulder, steadying her as the weight of the revelation settled over the room. "Are you certain this is not some manner of mistake?" he asked carefully. "I have verified the documentation extensively," Mr. Bennet said. "Birth records, your mother's marriage certificate, even a portrait your grandfather kept of your mother as a young woman, which I have brought with me for confirmation." He withdrew a small framed portrait from his case and handed it to Eleanor. Eleanor stared at the painted image of a young woman with familiar eyes and an unmistakable resemblance to her own reflection, tears filling her eyes as she recognized traces of her mother's face captured decades before Eleanor herself had ever been born. "This is her," she whispered. "This is my mother, before everything went wrong. Then I am pleased to inform you, Mrs. Whitmore, that you are the sole heir to the Ashworth estate, valued at a considerable fortune, including properties in 3 counties, extensive investments, and a substantial sum held in trust. Your grandfather's final wish was that his fortune find its way to the granddaughter he never had the chance to know." The news spread through Ashcombe Manor with astonishing speed. By evening, the entire staff had heard some version of the story, and the reaction among those who had once pitied Eleanor for her poverty shifted overnight into stunned disbelief. Margaret, who had slipped Eleanor extra bread during her first difficult weeks in the house, found herself near tears at the revelation. "All this time," Margaret said softly, finding Eleanor alone in the schoolroom that evening, staring blankly at a stack of Oliver's essays. "All this time we thought we were helping a poor young woman find her footing, and here you were, an heiress the entire while, though you never knew it yourself." "I never wanted pity, Margaret," Eleanor said quietly. I only wanted honest work and a place to belong. This fortune changes nothing about who I am inside. Perhaps not, Margaret said gently, but it will change everything about how the world treats you from this day forward, my lady. I suspect you should prepare yourself for that. Margaret's words proved prophetic almost immediately. Damien, who had remained largely silent since the solicitor's departure, found Eleanor later that night in their bedchamber, staring out at the dark grounds with an unreadable expression. "Are you troubled by this?" Eleanor asked quietly, sensing tension in his silence that had not been present before. Damien hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care. "I am troubled by nothing regarding your character, Eleanor, but I confess I am troubled by what others will now say about our marriage. They will claim I somehow discovered your fortune before proposing, that I married a hidden heiress for calculated reasons rather than genuine affection. The very people who mocked us for your poverty will now accuse me of the opposite deception." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression steady despite the exhaustion of the day's revelations. "Do you believe that of yourself, Damien? Do you believe you married me for a fortune neither of us knew existed until this very afternoon?" "No," Damien said firmly, closing the distance between them. "I know my own heart, Eleanor, and I know precisely why I asked you to marry me. But knowing the truth of my own intentions will not stop others from inventing a version of events that suits their gossip far better than the truth ever could." Eleanor reached for his hand, her voice quiet but resolute. "Then let them gossip. We know the truth, and the children know the truth, and Margaret knows the truth. That will have to be enough, because I refuse to let a fortune I did not even know I possessed until today poison what we have built together these past months." Damien pressed his forehead gently against hers, exhaling slowly. "I hope you are right, because I do not intend to lose you now. Not to gossip, and certainly not to a fortune neither of us asked for." But the following weeks would test that resolve more severely than either of them anticipated, as news of Eleanor's inheritance spread beyond the walls of Ashcombe Manor and into the drawing rooms of every family who had once dismissed her as an unsuitable match for a man of Damien's standing. The very society that had refused their wedding invitations now scrambled to reintroduce themselves, eager to curry favor with a woman whose fortune suddenly rivaled the wealthiest families in the county, and Eleanor found herself facing a far more dangerous form of judgment than the pity she had endured before. The calculating attention of people who now wanted something from her, rather than nothing at all. Lady Charlotte, in particular, arrived at Ashcombe Manor within days of the news reaching London society, her earlier hostility replaced by an unsettling sweetness that fooled no one, least of all Eleanor herself. "My dear sister," Charlotte said warmly, embracing Eleanor as though their previous encounters had never occurred. "I must say, I always sensed something exceptional about you. Something beyond your circumstances. I am simply delighted to see fortune has finally recognized what I saw from the very beginning." Eleanor accepted the embrace politely, though her eyes remained guarded. "How kind of you to say so, Lady Charlotte, though I recall our previous conversations rather differently." Charlotte's smile faltered only slightly before she recovered her composure entirely. "I am certain whatever misunderstandings occurred between us were simply products of difficult circumstances, now happily behind us. Perhaps we might begin anew, as the family we are meant to be." Eleanor said nothing further on the matter, though she made a private note to remain cautious of a woman whose affection had shifted so precisely in step with Eleanor's newly discovered wealth. She understood, with growing clarity, that her fortune had not erased the challenges of her new position in society. It had simply changed their shape entirely, replacing open scorn with something far more difficult to navigate. The false warmth of those who valued her circumstances far more than they valued her character. The rumors began quietly at first, whispered behind gloved hands at social gatherings Eleanor and Damien had been invited to for the first time since their wedding. By the time the whispers reached Eleanor directly, they had grown into something far uglier than simple gossip. Someone, it seemed, had suggested that Damien had known about Eleanor's connection to the Ashworth fortune long before the solicitor's arrival, that he had somehow arranged the entire courtship with calculated precision, choosing a penniless governess specifically because he suspected a hidden inheritance waiting to be claimed. Eleanor first heard the accusation directly from Lady Charlotte, though she suspected, given the timing, that Charlotte herself may have played some part in its origin. "People are saying the strangest things, my dear," Charlotte remarked one afternoon over tea, her tone carefully neutral. "Apparently there is talk that Damien had investigators looking into your family history months before your engagement. Some say he learned of your grandfather's failing health and saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore." Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care, though her hands trembled slightly. "That is not true, Charlotte, and I suspect you know it is not true." Of course," Charlotte said quickly. though her eyes betrayed something less than full conviction. "I simply thought you should be aware of what people are saying, so that you might prepare yourself accordingly." The rumor spread with alarming speed, gaining false details with each retelling, until Eleanor found herself facing pointed questions at nearly every social gathering she attended. Had Damien truly known about her inheritance beforehand? Had the entire courtship been nothing more than an elaborate scheme to secure a fortune through marriage rather than through more obvious, more scandalous means? Eleanor tried, at first, to dismiss the rumors as the inevitable price of sudden wealth, but the constant repetition began to wear at something deeper within her, a doubt she had not expected to feel about a man she loved and trusted completely. Late one evening, unable to sleep, she found herself staring at Damien across their bedchamber, a question forming that she almost could not bring herself to ask. "Did you know," she finally said, her voice small in the darkness, "before you proposed, did you have any knowledge at all of my grandfather, or the fortune he intended to leave behind?" Damien sat up immediately, his expression a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Eleanor, look at me, I swear to you, on the memory of my own parents, on the lives of Oliver and Grace, that I had no knowledge whatsoever of your grandfather's existence, let alone his fortune, until the moment Mr. Bennet arrived at our gates. I proposed to you because I could not imagine spending my life with anyone else, not because I suspected some hidden wealth waiting to be claimed." "I believe you," Eleanor said softly, though tears had gathered in her eyes despite her conviction. "I do believe you, Damien. But I find myself exhausted by a world that refuses to believe the simplest truth, that two people found each other honestly, without calculation, without scheme. I do not know how much longer I can bear the constant suspicion." Damien pulled her close, his voice fierce with quiet determination. "Then we will prove them wrong, together. Not through arguments or explanations, but through actions they cannot twist into scandal, no matter how hard they try." The following week, Damien took an unprecedented step that shocked everyone who heard of it, family and staff alike. He arranged through Mr. Bennet to formally and legally renounce any personal claim to Eleanor's inheritance, ensuring that every property, every investment, every shilling of the Ashworth fortune remained entirely and permanently in Eleanor's name alone, with no legal pathway for him to access or control any portion of it, regardless of what might happen to their marriage in the future. "You did not need to do this," Eleanor said, staring at the signed documents Mr. Bennet had delivered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never doubted your intentions enough to require legal proof." "Perhaps you did not," Damien said gently, "but society clearly requires more convincing than your trust alone can offer. Let them see, in writing, that I want nothing from your fortune except the privilege of watching you use it however you see fit. Let them find something else to gossip about, because they will find no scandal in a man who has legally surrendered any claim to his wife's wealth." The gesture, once it became known throughout society, silenced the worst of the rumors almost overnight. Even Lady Charlotte, upon hearing of the legal arrangement, seemed genuinely taken aback, her earlier sweetness replaced by something closer to grudging respect. "I confess, brother," Charlotte said during her next visit, "I did not expect you to go so far to prove a point. Perhaps I misjudged the situation, and perhaps I misjudged your wife as well." "Perhaps you did," Damien said simply, offering no further comment on the matter, though Eleanor noticed a new warmth in his sister's manner from that day forward, one that felt, for the first time, genuinely earned rather than calculated. With the worst of the scandal behind them, Eleanor turned her attention toward a decision that had been forming in her mind since the day Mr. Bennet first revealed the extent of her inheritance. She did not want the fortune to sit idle in accounts and properties she rarely visited, nor did she wish to use it simply to elevate her own social standing among people who had once dismissed her as unworthy of their company. Instead, she began quietly establishing a foundation, funded entirely from her own inheritance, dedicated to supporting families facing the same hardships she and her mother had endured after being cast out by relatives who valued status over compassion. She funded scholarships for children whose families could not otherwise afford proper education, established shelters for women abandoned by their own families, and created positions for governesses and tutors who, like herself, had once struggled to find stable employment despite genuine talent and dedication. Damien watched this transformation with quiet pride, often finding Eleanor late in the evenings poring over ledgers and proposals with the same careful diligence she had once applied to Oliver and Grace's lessons. "You could have simply enjoyed your fortune," he remarked one evening, watching her review a proposal for a new shelter in the northern counties. "Many in your position would have done exactly that, without a second thought toward those left behind." "I remember what it felt like to have nothing," Eleanor said quietly, not looking up from her papers. "I remember the fear of an empty stomach, the shame of arriving somewhere in torn clothing, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might show kindness rather than judgment. I cannot simply forget those feelings now that fortune has changed my own circumstances. If anything, I feel a greater responsibility to ensure others do not suffer as I once did. Damien knelt beside her chair, taking her hand gently in his own. This is precisely why I fell in love with you, Eleanor. Not the fortune, not even your intelligence or your patience with our children, though I treasure both. It is this, exactly this, the way your heart remains soft and generous despite everything life demanded of you. Eleanor smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. And this is why I chose to stay, Damien, even when the whole world seemed determined to convince me our marriage could never survive the scandal. You proved, again and again, that some things matter more than gossip, more than fortune, more than the opinions of people who never truly understood either of us. As the years passed, Ashcombe Manor became known throughout the county not for the scandal of its master's unconventional marriage, but for the genuine warmth and generosity that seemed to radiate from every corner of the estate. Oliver grew into a thoughtful young man who often accompanied Eleanor on visits to the Foundation's newest projects, while Grace, now approaching her teenage years, had developed a passion for teaching that mirrored the woman who had first sparked her curiosity about the world. Margaret, still the household's devoted housekeeper, often remarked to newer staff members about the strange and wonderful turn of fate that had brought a soaked, penniless governess through the gates of Ashcombe Manor on a stormy evening years before, only to watch her transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who might otherwise have been forgotten by a society more concerned with status than kindness. Lady Charlotte, in time, became one of the Foundation's most enthusiastic supporters, hosting fundraising events for causes she had once considered beneath her attention, a transformation she herself credited entirely to watching Eleanor's quiet, unwavering integrity in the face of every obstacle society had placed before her. And Eleanor, standing in the gardens of Ashcombe Manor on a quiet evening, years after her difficult arrival, watching her husband laugh with their children beneath the same trees where she had once twisted her ankle on a cold autumn afternoon, understood at last the true meaning of the fortune she had inherited. It was never simply about the properties or the investments or the substantial sums held in trust. It was about the freedom to build a life defined not by the pity or scorn of others, but by genuine love, hard-earned respect, and the quiet, powerful satisfaction of using whatever fortune life provided to lift others toward the same happiness she had, finally, against every early expectation, found for herself. 5 years into their marriage, a challenge arrived that neither Eleanor nor Damien had anticipated, one that threatened to undo everything they had carefully built since the day Mr. Bennet first appeared at the gates of Ashcombe Manor. A distant cousin of the late Charles Ashworth, a man named Edmund Carlyle who had spent years abroad and returned only after learning of the fortune left behind, filed a legal challenge against the will, claiming that Eleanor's connection to the family had never been properly verified, and that the entire inheritance rightfully belonged to him, as the nearest surviving male relative. The news reached Eleanor on an otherwise ordinary morning, delivered by a grim-faced Mr. Bennet, who had traveled from London specifically to warn her of the coming legal battle. He intends to argue that the portrait and documents I gathered 5 years ago were insufficient proof, Mr. Bennet explained, spreading a stack of papers across the study table. He has hired solicitors known for aggressive tactics, and he intends to argue his case before a judge within the month. Eleanor felt a familiar coldness settle over her, the same fear she had carried through years of poverty now returning in a different, more dangerous form. Can he truly take this from us? From the Foundation? From everyone depending on it? It is possible, Mr. Bennet admitted carefully, though I do not believe his claim holds real merit. Courts can be unpredictable, particularly when facing a determined opponent with considerable resources of his own. Damien, who had listened silently throughout the exchange, finally spoke with quiet determination. Then we shall meet his resources with resources of our own, and more importantly, with truth. Eleanor's claim was verified thoroughly 5 years ago. We will not allow a stranger's greed to undo everything she has built for people who have nothing to do with this dispute. The following weeks proved among the most difficult of their marriage, filled with depositions, document reviews, and the constant, exhausting presence of lawyers picking apart every detail of Eleanor's past. Edmund Carlyle, it turned out, had spent considerable effort attempting to discredit the original documentation, even suggesting publicly that Eleanor's mother had never truly been disowned at all, and that the entire inheritance had been secured through manipulation rather than legitimate family connection. Eleanor bore the accusations with a steadiness that surprised even herself, though the strain showed in quiet moments when she believed no one was watching. Late one evening, Grace, now a young woman of considerable perception, found her stepmother standing alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular. "You are worried," Grace said simply, joining her beneath the same trees where Eleanor had once fallen years before. "I am," Eleanor admitted, "not for myself, but for everyone the foundation supports. If this man succeeds in his claim, families who depend on our scholarships and shelters will lose that support entirely." Grace took her hand, her voice steady beyond her years. "Then we shall simply have to make certain he does not succeed. You taught me once that the truth, spoken clearly and without fear, carries more weight than any amount of gossip or manipulation. I believe that lesson applies here as much as it did in our schoolroom all those years ago." Eleanor smiled despite her worry, struck by how completely the child she had once taught to read had grown into a young woman capable of offering wisdom in return. The court proceedings, when they finally began, proved tense and exhausting, with Edmund Carlisle's solicitors questioning every detail of Eleanor's history with pointed, often cruel precision. But Mr. Bennet had prepared thoroughly, presenting not only the original birth records and portrait, but additional testimony from elderly relatives of Charles Ashworth, who confirmed the long-standing estrangement between the old man and his daughter, and the genuine joy he had expressed upon finally locating his granddaughter before his death. The turning point came when Margaret, now elderly but sharp as ever, insisted on testifying personally, describing the desperate, soaked young woman who had arrived at Ashcombe Manor years before, with nothing but a broken suitcase and a letter of recommendation, a woman who had shown no knowledge whatsoever of any hidden fortune until the solicitor's unexpected arrival months into her employment. "I have worked in that house for over 20 years, Margaret told the courtroom, her voice steady despite her age. "I watched that young woman arrive with holes in her shoes and nothing but determination to her name. Whatever this man claims about manipulation and deception, I can assure this court that nothing about Eleanor Whitmore's arrival or her marriage suggested anything but genuine hardship, followed by genuine, hard-earned happiness." The judge, moved by the weight of evidence and testimony presented, ultimately dismissed Edmund Carlisle's claim entirely, ruling that the original inheritance had been properly and legally established, and that no evidence supported his assertion of manipulation or fraud. Carlisle left the courtroom in bitter silence, his reputation considerably diminished by the very accusations he had leveled against a woman the county had come to genuinely respect and admire. The victory, when it finally came, brought a relief that Eleanor had not fully realized she needed until the weight lifted from her shoulders entirely. That evening, surrounded by her family in the same drawing room where Lady Charlotte had once mocked her torn shoes, Eleanor allowed herself to finally exhale, years of quiet anxiety releasing at last. "It is over," Damien said softly, wrapping his arms around her as their children celebrated nearby. "Truly over, this time. No more challenges, no more scandal, simply the life we have built together, finally secure." "I never imagined," Eleanor said quietly, "that a stormy evening years ago, arriving here with nothing but a broken suitcase, would lead to a life so completely different from anything I once dared to hope for." Oliver, now a grown man managing much of the Foundation's daily operations, raised a glass in celebration. "To the woman who taught us that character matters more than circumstance," he said, "and who proved it again and again, no matter what challenges life placed before her." The Foundation continued to grow in the years that followed, eventually supporting families across multiple counties, funding scholarships for hundreds of children who might otherwise have been forgotten, and establishing a reputation throughout the region as one of the most respected charitable institutions of its time. Eleanor herself became known not merely as a wealthy woman of considerable influence, but as someone who genuinely understood the hardships faced by those without privilege, having lived through those very hardships herself before fortune and love changed the course of her life entirely. Ashcombe Manor, once known primarily for the quiet grief that had settled over it following Damien's first wife's passing, became instead a place filled with laughter, learning, and genuine warmth, a transformation the entire county eventually came to credit not to fortune or inheritance, but to the simple, powerful truth that had guided Eleanor since her earliest, most difficult days, that kindness, patience, and unwavering integrity could withstand any storm, any scandal, and any challenge life chose to place in their path. And so the story of the poor governess everyone once pitied became, in time, a story told throughout the county, not as a cautionary tale of scandal or misfortune, but as a testament to the quiet, extraordinary power of genuine love, proving that the truest fortune anyone could inherit was never measured in properties or investments, but in the character built through hardship, and the family found through unexpected, undeserved grace. There was one final test the family would face, though it arrived quietly, without lawyers or courtrooms, in a form neither Eleanor nor Damien expected. It came in the shape of a letter from a small coastal town, written by a woman named Clara Hartley, a nurse who had cared for Eleanor's mother during her final illness many years before Eleanor's arrival at Ashcombe Manor. Clara wrote to say she had recently read of the Ashworth inheritance dispute in a regional newspaper, and recognized the name Eleanor Whitmore as belonging to the daughter her patient had spoken of so often during her final days. Enclosed with the letter was a small bundle of papers Clara had kept safe for over a decade, letters Eleanor's mother had written but never sent, addressed to her own father, Charles Ashworth, in the years before either of them died. Eleanor read the letters alone in the library one quiet afternoon, her hands trembling as she absorbed her mother's words for the first time. Words written in private anguish that Eleanor had never known existed. In them, her mother described the loneliness of estrangement, the pride that kept her from reaching out even as illness took hold of her body, and the quiet hope, mentioned in the final letter, that her daughter might one day find happiness that had eluded her own difficult life. "I do not know if my father will ever soften enough to welcome Eleanor, should something happen to me," her mother had written in careful, fading handwriting, "but I pray that whatever path she walks, she finds it walked with dignity, and that whoever loves her sees the same strength in her that I have always seen, even in our hardest years together." Eleanor wept quietly over the letters, grief and gratitude tangled together in a way she had not experienced since her mother's passing. When Damien found her there, he said nothing at first, simply sitting beside her and reading the letters she offered him in silence. "She never stopped loving her father," Eleanor finally said, "even after everything he did to us. And somehow, without ever meeting me, she still hoped I would find exactly what I found here. With you." "Then perhaps," Damien said gently, "this inheritance was never simply about fortune at all. Perhaps it was your mother's final wish reaching you, long after she could no longer speak it herself." Eleanor chose to have the letters preserved and displayed, in time, within a small memorial room established at the Foundation's main office, alongside a portrait of her mother as a young woman, ensuring that every family who walked through those doors seeking assistance would understand the story behind the fortune supporting them. Not simply wealth passed down through legal documents, but love that persisted across estrangement, illness, and loss, finally finding its way home through a granddaughter who had once believed herself entirely forgotten by fortune and family alike. Grace, now grown and managing much of the Foundation's educational programs, often told this part of the story to new scholarship recipients, explaining that the money supporting their studies came not from cold inheritance alone, but from a mother's unspoken hope that her daughter would build something meaningful from whatever circumstances life provided. Oliver, meanwhile, had taken a particular interest in expanding the Foundation's reach into neighboring counties, working alongside Eleanor to establish additional shelters and scholarship programs modeled after the very support Eleanor herself had once desperately needed, and rarely received during her own difficult youth. Years passed in this manner, the Foundation growing steadily, the family at Ashcombe Manor deepening in warmth and closeness with each passing season. Damien, watching his wife address a room full of scholarship recipients one autumn afternoon, found himself thinking back to the storm-soaked evening when she had first arrived at his gates, exhausted, penniless, and utterly unaware of the remarkable life waiting to unfold before her. He thought of Lady Charlotte's early cruelty, now replaced entirely by genuine partnership in the Foundation's charitable work. He thought of the whispered accusations that had once threatened to poison their marriage, now silenced permanently by legal documents, and, more importantly, by years of demonstrated devotion that no amount of gossip could ever undermine. He thought of Edmund Carlyle's failed challenge, and the quiet satisfaction of watching truth prevail over greed and manipulation. But mostly, he thought of the woman standing before him now, no longer the frightened governess who had once feared losing her position within a week, but a confident, compassionate leader who had transformed not only her own circumstances, but the circumstances of countless families who might otherwise have been forgotten entirely by a society more concerned with status than genuine character. "You are staring," Eleanor said later that evening, catching him watching her across the drawing room with an expression of quiet wonder. "I am simply remembering," Damien said, taking her hand, "how close I came to losing you, before I ever truly had you. How easily circumstances or pride or the expectations of others could have kept us apart entirely. But they did not," Eleanor said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as their children's laughter drifted in from the garden beyond. "Because in the end, Damien, character always mattered more than circumstance, in your heart, if nowhere else in this world. And that, more than any fortune I inherited, is the truest gift either of us ever received. Outside, the gardens of Ashcombe Manor stretched golden and peaceful beneath the late afternoon sun, the same grounds where Eleanor had once twisted her ankle on a cold autumn day, where Damien had first carried her home with a tenderness neither of them fully understood at the time, and where their children now ran freely, secure in a happiness built not on inherited fortune alone, but on years of hard-won trust, unwavering integrity, and a love that had proven, time and again, strong enough to withstand whatever storms life chose to place before it.